The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Email us right now. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, right to your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be with you here again today, and especially this morning. And I'll give you a little story that goes along with that shortly. But we have a wonderful guest today, Dr. Steve Taylor, and he is the author of The Leap and Extraordinary Awakenings When Trauma Leads to Transformation, amongst many other books and articles. He specializes in transpersonal psychology, which he's going to explain to us in a minute. And his current book looks at what happens to us when we experience something that could be devastating, but then leads to post-traumatic growth or an inner awakening where the things that might be holding us back, or the perceptions that we might have about our life or the limits of our life, can crack open in an experience of awakening. I don't even know if I've done a good job of that, Steve, but I want to welcome you back to the show. And I know we have spoken on a couple of occasions. We have had a couple of times where we've scheduled to have you on the show, and a couple of times had to reschedule. And the first time you had COVID, and the second time I had an appendicitis, and the third time, which is today, I almost had to cancel again because I have surgery scheduled for tomorrow morning. And I had really early morning pre-op today. So I'm super glad that I'm actually wide awake because I've been up since 5. And I want to know how you're doing today, Steve, and welcome back.
Thank you, Anna. It's great to be with you. Yeah, we finally made it, which is great. Yeah, exactly. I'm well, thank you. Yeah, I'm very well.
Good. Yeah, I know, because we actually had a really fantastic conversation for about an hour and decided that we wanted to do the show live because we want to invite our listeners to email and let us know if they have something to share with us, some comments or questions about this remarkable work that you're doing, this extraordinary awakenings, and this whole idea of trauma leading to transformation. And, just this idea that, I think it's a very hopeful idea. And I know you've done a lot of interviews and research about it, where you're looking at what happens to people in a variety of different situations when they experience something profound. And then instead of, really not ever being able to recover, they have these remarkable experiences where they really grow, or they, in some ways, it seems from reading your book, they kind of shed a layer of what might be holding them back from having the life that they actually want to have. And, I want to just start by congratulating you on the book, because it was quite profound to read it. And ask you if you will just start with describing what transpersonal psychology is for our listeners today.
Transpersonal psychology literally means beyond the ego. Transpersonal literally means beyond the ego. So transpersonal psychology studies states where we transcend our normal identity, states of expansive experience. Sometimes they can be temporary, when people have what I call awakening experiences. So that's when our consciousness expands for a few moments, maybe a few minutes, or maybe a few hours. But it can also be a long-term ongoing thing when people undergo a permanent transformation, which is what I investigate in the book.
Exactly. Well, it seems like you investigate all of those things, the beyond the ego state, this transcending of identity, and both temporary and permanent awakenings, this consciousness expanding state. So, I think that, in terms of psychology, I mean, when I studied psychology, undergraduate and graduate school, I can assure you that nobody ever spoke about consciousness, the transcending identity, the ego state, particularly, the rigidity of the ego state. When we get into these places where we're so stuck and we're like, no, like life won't be right if I don't have this house or that degree or this car or, that relationship. And it's like, really, really, will that be the end of it? And just the rigidity of that, and how that kind of steals from us rather than contributes to our well-being. I wonder what your thoughts are. Like, why do you think that people who are studying psychology in general don't actually look at these awakening states or the possibility of post-traumatic growth?
I think the aim of conventional psychology from Freud onwards has always been to build a strong ego, to create a healthy, functioning ego that can kind of, get by in everyday life and do well, enable you to do well in society. But, even now, I think that's almost like the end point of development, according to most psychologists. But transpersonal psychology suggests that once you have an ego, that's not the end. The next stage is to transcend the ego, or to expand the ego. The next stage is to investigate what lies beyond normal awareness. So, it's definitely an emerging trend, though. I think more and more, certainly more and more students are getting interested in transpersonal psychology. There's still a bit of resistance to it in conventional psychology, because it still has this idea that, normality.
I think I just lost you there for a moment, Steve.
Sorry.
Can you repeat that?
Said in normal psychology, there's still an idea that normality is the end point of development.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because this ego state that people can get into, this, what I was saying before, like this idea of, you should have these rigid ideas of how the world works, and be very confident about the degree you hold and the car you drive and the sense of confidence you have in how the world functions. And it's like holding on to a lot of that. I mean, it does make sense. We want to be able to function in the world, but we also want to be able to say, and I am not in control in this moment, and that's okay. And I think that takes enormous courage.
I think so, yeah. And I think it's something that people discover spontaneously as well. Often when you do get to a point in life when you feel like you've succeeded, when you've reached middle age and you're fairly successful, you've got possessions, you've got a certain degree of security, you've got a family and so forth. Some people reach a point of frustration, when they ask themselves, is this all that life's about? Is there anything more? And they start to feel an internal longing for something more meaningful. And that frustration, I sometimes call that spiritual depression, because it's an urge for something larger, something deeper and more authentic to unfold inside you.
I think that is such a beautiful thing that you just said. And I think I see it every single day, this hunger for something more. And I don't want to use the word more profound, because in a way it seems like more expansive. And, what that might actually be. I do want to ask you, it seems to me that you have spent a lifetime writing about I mean, this book, it's really about awakening, transformation through turmoil, but really it seems like you've spent a whole career writing about just this topic, and it's a very unique focus. How did you ever kind of find yourself moving in this direction?
It was very spontaneous. I mean, I didn't even think about this until many years later, but when I was a teenager, maybe 16 or 17 years old, I was very depressed. I felt very alienated and frustrated. I didn't understand myself and I didn't like myself. But occasionally I'd get these moments where I felt kind of uplifted. I felt kind of taken beyond my depression and frustration. And a sense of well-being would fill me, and a sense of feeling of harmony and connection with my surroundings would fill me, usually when I was walking in natural surroundings. So years later, I thought, well, maybe these euphoric experiences were connected to the turmoil that I was going through. And years after that, probably about 16, 17 years ago now, I had an experience, well, the only time in my life when I've been seriously ill, when I was in hospital for a few weeks. And, it was for a while, there was a chance that I might not survive. So, but when I recovered, when I was in the process of recovering, I felt this amazing sense of gratitude and meaning and purpose. I felt like I was really aware of the value of everything in my life, all of the people in my life, all of the tiniest, most simple experiences in my life. I felt so lucky just to be here, these experiences. I felt so lucky just to be alive in this moment, in this body, in this world. And it didn't, obviously it de-intensified after a while, but I think it kind of remained a lower level. I think I can still sense that now. So I think that's what encouraged me to really investigate these experiences and to find how common they were in other people.
So it came, but then it didn't stay entirely. It was temporary on some level, this awakening that you had, and yet you still talk about it. When I heard you speak about it, it was like it sounded so fresh.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite common in these kind of transformational experiences for them to, initially, they're incredibly powerful, they're explosive, and they change people's perception of the world radically. They change their identity radically. But they do tend to de-intensify. They don't disappear, but they become less intense. They sort of stabilize at a lower level of intensity. Maybe that's just because they're so explosive that it would be difficult to function in that state in everyday life. You have to sort of integrate it and balance it. So that was the case with me. It faded, but it kind of remained at a stable, less intense level.
So, I find it really interesting hearing these kinds of stories as well. And to me, they seem to be quite surprisingly common. I mean, having spent my life talking to people with significant traumatic experiences, I have heard about these kinds of things over many, many years. And I actually had an experience when I was really quite young. I was in Pakistan in the mountains, close to K2, and I had contracted malaria and giardia at the same time. So I was like super sick in this tiny little village in the middle of nowhere. And there was this little clinic. And I was with a friend, and he was well enough to find the clinic, which was down a dirt path. It was a one room wooden structure. And we were diagnosed with malaria and giardia. And, you get very dehydrated, but malaria actually makes you very unwell, and your thinking gets very distorted, and then they prescribe quinine to help you with it, and then the quinine further impairs your thinking. So the state that I was in at that time was just very extraordinary, very unusual, and left me without the same structured belief system, because you really couldn't hang on. This was before I became a psychologist. I was only 19 at the time, and I was traveling with a friend, and nobody could have ever imagined getting that sick in the middle of nowhere, because you just take it for granted that you're going to be fine at 19 no matter what you do. But I mean, having had that experience, I think it helped me when people share with me today the kinds of things that they become aware of after they've experienced something very disturbing or traumatic. And I had somebody send an email. I'm just going to read it. This one is from Sherry, and she writes, when I was 27, this is a little shocking. So I would ask my listeners to take this in the light of post-traumatic growth, because this is really a story of facing profound difficulties and then elevating out of that. So please take this in that light. If you listen to this and you find it difficult, it's not unusual. When I was 27, my husband at the time ran over me with a car because he needed my paycheck for his gambling addiction. This is pretty shocking. That began my journey to canes, to crutches, and for about the last 7 or so years, mostly a wheelchair for mobility. I was an evangelical, and divorce was not an option. A few years later, however, he held a butcher knife on our children and me and said blood was going to run in that room like water. I breathed a prayer to the only way we were going to get out of that room. And it was this: if God provided it. I was thinking a stroke or heart attack. I think she's talking about her husband. He got diarrhea, and I had enough time while he was in the bathroom to grab our small children, my purse, and legal documents and get to our car, lock the doors. I backed into traffic, requiring some angels to think and move quickly. There were no accidents. The court system added to that trauma when I attempted to have my husband committed to a psychiatric facility. The judge told me this was nothing more than my needing to be a good wife. Wow, Sherry, if you can imagine. The judge told her to go home and love my husband, and I wouldn't have these problems. I was devastated. It's quite a long story to now, but I moved from that town, came to Pennsylvania, went back to college, including a PhD program. I love this woman already, don't you, Steve? She sounds incredible. It's incredible. Become a trauma therapist, wrote the standard for determining if a woman qualified as a battered woman and whether she qualified then to be judged according to that standard. And now at the age of 73, I'm an activist for justice, currently on day 34 of a hunger strike for voting justice. I believe this and other trauma have played a significant role in bringing me to the life I now live. I don't really have any pressing questions, and hope my story is helpful. Looking forward to your program. Now, isn't that remarkable? I have to tell you, Steve, I'm reading this letter that came to me December the 29th in anticipation of our first radio show that had to be canceled. And I've hung on to it because it's such a remarkable story.
Yeah, it's both shocking and incredible and kind of inspiring. An amazing example of transformation through turmoil.
Yeah, and I mean, one would make a wrong presumption to assume that this woman now has PTSD or, because of these terrible things can't cope or can't do anything meaningful. And clearly she's doing a lot of meaningful things in her day-to-day life. And I love stories like that because it just reinforces this idea that, we can remain hopeful even in the most dire moments, that we can, find ourselves moving toward our own growth and evolution and not away from it, even when things are incredibly difficult.
I mean, often we don't find out how, when life is running smoothly and comfortably, we don't get access to the resources that are inside us. But there's so much which normally lies asleep inside us. But when we do go through trauma or crises or challenges, suddenly we have to turn inside, and we draw on these deep resources of resilience, this spiritual strength inside us. So when the crisis passes or becomes less intense, that resilience still remains inside us. So we still maintain that level of that depth and that strength within us.
I think that's why anticipatory fear, like something like knowing that you're going to undergo something, can be more frightening than going through the thing that you.
Oh, definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I once wrote a poem about that because I used to be years ago, I had a terrible fear of flying. And then it just struck me one day that I had to go on a flight to America. It was quite a long flight from here in the UK, and I was dreading it. But then at a certain point, I realized that, it was the thoughts about flying that were causing me pain. And I realized that the reality may not be so painful. So when I actually got on the plane, I realized that the reality was not painful. If you can face the reality of situations, they are always less painful than the anticipation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this morning I was anticipating somebody putting a needle in my arm and drawing blood, which I didn't really like that much. But when I got there, they told me they didn't need my blood, which made me super happy, right? So
Yeah.
it would have been really a waste of time for me to spend a lot of energy worrying about having that blood taking, huh? And I mean, that's what we do often.
Oh yeah. When we are faced with the reality of situations, that's when we draw on the strength and resilience within us. So we realize that we are stronger than we realized.
Yeah, that is really beautiful, because and this is really what I've seen in a lot of people, that it is in the moment, when we have to face the struggle, that we find the strength, and not before. So you can build up lots of great skills and coping strategies, but you can't even anticipate what is available in the moment that you need it most. And I think that is so, it's just so remarkable. I want to ask you something about this idea of this state, this transcendent state, this awakening state, this uplifted possibility. I mean, because people are going to wonder, in your experience, do you find, or do you believe that is available to everybody?
I do. Yes. I mean, I think that what we normally accept as normal awareness or our normal mode of functioning is actually quite limited. And there are certain moments when we experience a more expansive awareness, and then we do realize, there's more to the world than I believed, and there's a sort of wider, deeper dimension of reality than I suspected. And it's always there. I think it's only our ego boundaries that separate us from it. Only our sort of strong, normal sense of identity. Because, I think, young children have access to these states as well. If, maybe people can remember that when they were young children, the world seemed incredibly exhilarating and everything seemed fascinating. And there was this sense of connection to everything around them, this sense of natural well-being and exhilarating energy. I think as we become adults, and our egos develop, we lose touch with that kind of dynamic, expansive awareness. But in spiritual awakening, we can regain it. I'm not saying that we return to the state of being a child, which would obviously be a mistake in some ways, with all the kind of narcissism which that entails. But we kind of recapture it at a higher level. And, everything becomes fascinating. We transcend normal worries and seem trivial, a sort of appreciation, a feeling of connection to nature and to other people. So life, it's not an esoteric state. It's not so different from normal awareness, but it's just more expansive and more intense and more exhilarating. So yeah, I do think it's available to everybody.
Good. I'm glad, because I think people will want to know that, yes, this is available to them, especially our listeners, because many of them have experienced significant traumas, and it doesn't mean that they'll stay in that state forever. But I am curious, when you think about it, if people have had this expansive awareness, this sense of harmony or well-being, at some point in their life and, feel like they'd like to reconnect with that. Do you think that there are ways for people to do that?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, there are many practices and activities which can, well, they don't automatically generate this awareness, but they can definitely encourage it, or they can create the conditions to cultivate it.
Yeah, because, in your book,
for example,
Steve, I'm sorry.
No, carry on.
In your book, you have this little story about somebody who talks to a Buddhist monk and is describing, a traumatic event, and then this expanded state of awareness, this awakening experience. And the monk says to the individual, like, don't share that with the other monks, because, a lot of them are here wishing and hoping and practicing and waiting for exactly what you're describing, and they haven't had it yet, and they've been practicing for years.
That's right. Yeah, he said, "Don't talk about this too loudly," or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but I mean, a lot of people who follow spiritual paths of some form, like the Buddhists we were just talking about, they're trying to cultivate this awareness. But I mean, I think meditation is a great way of cultivating it. Meditation calms the mind, creates a sense of space and inner energy, which can give rise to this state. Also, things like contact with nature. Contact with nature is a great way of stilling the mind and generating a feeling of connection. And like service for other people, connecting with other people through service, through kindness. That's a great way of transcending the ego and connecting to a wider reality. So all of these practices will, if you practice meditation or service or contact with nature on a daily basis, I think it's inevitable that you will move towards this expansive awareness over time.
Neat. I want to talk about the book a little bit. In the book you describe a whole bunch of different types of traumas or troubles that people might experience: warfare, incarceration, bereavement, serious illness or potential of death, addiction, depression, post-traumatic stress, what you call intense mortality encounters. And I'm just wondering, if you find yourself in a situation like this, something that is incredibly difficult, I mean, what would you tell people about that in terms of, how to cope or how to prepare themselves to understand that they can experience something uplifting even when they are heading into or anticipating something terrifying?
Well, yeah, I mean, I thought long and hard about this, because everybody goes through traumatic experiences, but not everybody, a lot of people do, but not everybody experiences growth or transformation as a result of them. So I identified a couple of factors which seem to help transformation or growth to occur. And probably the most important one is an attitude of acknowledgement and acceptance. So, it's very important to face the reality of your predicament rather than diverting yourself or distracting yourself, or maybe self-medicating to escape the reality of it. So, the reality of the predicament may seem painful, but if you face up to it, as we said before, you usually find that it's not, that you can deal with it, that it's not going to overwhelm you or destroy you, because you have the inner resources to acknowledge it and to accept it. So that's really important. Acknowledgement seems to be the first step. But also I found that, people who undergo growth and transformation, it usually involves some degree of self-exploration, some degree of sort of stepping inside yourself to observe your own feelings, even if they appear painful, to observe your own thinking processes. You have to be able to sort of step inside yourself and enter your mental space and observe and explore your thoughts and feelings. And then if you can accept the predicament and also your own thoughts, negative thoughts and feelings, if you can step into a mode of openness and embrace everything about the predicament, that seems to be the key to transformation. A lot of the people I spoke to, they could identify one specific moment when they underwent a transformation. And it was often in a mode of acceptance, when they let go of their resistance, when they handed over their problem, or when they just, surrendered in some way, let go. So that, yeah, those qualities seem to be very important.
It's interesting because in a lot of ways in psychology, when people get trained to become psychologists, there's a turning away rather than within. And the beauty of what you're describing is this acceptance, this leaning towards, this exploring, recognizing that we can grow and learn from the pain, and this surrendering, this letting go. A lot of the times, it's easy to see why somebody would want to fight it rather than allow it. And what are your thoughts about this allow it versus fight it?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because we are trained to fight, to resist, to overcome. And also, if you have physical pain, it's entirely natural for you to want to avoid it, to numb it with medication or just to divert yourself from it in some way. So we do the same with psychological pain. We try to avoid it. We try to divert ourselves from it. But it seems to be counterproductive. I mean, there's a lot of research in mindfulness suggesting that, if you bring your awareness to pain, if you accept pain, whether it's physical or psychological, it will have a beneficial effect in some way. That the pain will become softer, will become less acute. So, I think we do need to cease to resist at some point. It's like a good example is I found in my book that a lot of people, it's not uncommon for people to undergo transformation after a diagnosis of cancer. And part of that is because, a diagnosis of cancer is an encounter with mortality. It threatens everything about your life. It threatens your life itself and everything in your life. So obviously it's a terrible prospect. And some people obviously feel incredibly anxious and depressed about it. But there were certain people I found, they, rather than collapsing into a mode of despair and bitterness, they suddenly underwent a shift into a more positive mode. They became aware of how incredibly precious life is. They became aware of the beauty of everything around them. They became aware of the value of all the people in their lives. And life itself became a kind of miracle because they realized it was so temporary and fragile. But they were often the people who, going back to what we said earlier, they acknowledged and accepted the reality of their predicament. They were aware of the reality of death and everything that a diagnosis of cancer meant. But I also found that these people tended to have less kind of controlling personalities, less kind of egoic personalities. It reminds me of a friend of mine, actually, who underwent a transformation. He became a therapist at a cancer hospital here in Manchester, England. And he said that he could always, when he dealt with cancer patients, he would always know or have a good idea about who would undergo a positive transformation and who wouldn't. I said, well, how did you ascertain that? And he said, I can always tell whether someone's got a controlling personality. He said, often it's people in very kind of high status positions, like head teachers or lawyers, or people who are very kind of egoic and professional and high status. Apologies to anybody in those roles. This is obviously a generalization, but he said that people with controlling personalities, they're less likely to let go, less likely to surrender. They keep fighting, keep resisting. And that kind of egoic mode of resistance seems to block the transformation.
Wow, that's interesting. I had an interesting experience in February when I was in hospital with appendicitis, and I was in a room with 3 people, myself and 2 others. And the woman who was in the bed across from me had a very, very complex cancer surgery. And every time she opened her mouth, she lit up the room with light. I swear it was the most interesting thing. She would just speak with the staff. And as she was speaking, you can see how the mood elevated in the space, how the staff were responding to her with such joy. And here she was, recovering from, I mean, you just can't imagine how complex her cancer surgery was, but her frame of mind was incredible. It was lovely to encounter her. And she was in a
Yeah.
quite diminished state and yet incredibly elevated. Like I felt uplifted by her presence in the room. Like it was that profound. It was really something else. I want to read some of the emails that are coming in fast and furiously. So maybe we can spend a little bit of time doing that. The first one, which is very important, is from Riley. Hi, Riley. Riley asks, where can I purchase Steve's book? Do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Through any major online bookseller, or you can go to my website, which is stephenmtaylor.com. That's Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com. But you could go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble, any of those places.
So I want to remind everybody that the book, the most recent book by Steve Taylor, is Extraordinary Awakenings: When Trauma Leads to Transformation. But what I will say is, please look up all of Steve's books, because I have to say I've read more than one, and I found The Leap was particularly interesting. It was a very easy read, a good place to start in a way. This most recent book is just gripping in terms of some of the stories that are really so complex. And if you have had a traumatic experience and have found yourself having these awakenings or consciousness uplifting experiences, it's super helpful to have something to help you understand that it's not uncommon. I think people can feel really alone, Steve, when they have
That's
these,
right.
right? Isn't that the case? Have you found that with the people that you have interviewed, that they feel alone?
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
Mhm.
people feel exhilarated and connected. They feel a strong sense of well-being, but it can be overlaid with a feeling of confusion because they're not really sure what's happened to them. Other people around them may think they've gone a bit crazy, so they may start to doubt the validity of what's happened to them. Particularly if they haven't got any background in psychology or spirituality. But I mean, eventually they always gravitate towards some sort of framework to make sense of, and they find out about Buddhism or spirituality or post-traumatic growth, and they think, wow, that's what's happened to me. But yeah, initially there can be a phase of confusion.
Yeah, it's like, oh my God, why am I so, like, why does everything seem like one and so beautiful and harmonious when I'm going through this terrible time? This makes no sense. I'm smiling all the time, but something terrible just happened, and trying to make sense of that. And yeah, it does happen. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
This one is
there was one guy. Oh, sorry, excuse me.
There was one guy. Yes.
I was just going to say, there's one guy in my book. He was confused about what had happened to him. He found a book of psychiatric disorders and started to look for it, looking for his disorder. I think, have I got manic bipolar disorder, psychosis? But he couldn't identify his symptoms. And then he found a book by Eckhart Tolle. I think it was The Power of Now. And he thought, this is what's happened to me. So, he wasn't sure what happened until he found that book.
Right, because now he started to connect not with the possibility of having a psychiatric disorder, but something natural and life affirming has happened to him. And
exactly.
I think that can be a little bit confusing when you're going through something really, really tough, that in fact, it's not something bad, it's something good. This one is from George, and George is just sharing. Hi, George. All materialistic things here on earth mean nothing in the afterlife. Well, this is very, very true. People live for these things. What is more important is people, health, happiness, without buying things, and faith. Thanks. Well, thank you, George. And yes, I do think that we tend to go down the wrong path when we, and that's really the ego state that makes us feel like we have to adhere so closely to those things, that those are the things that are so important, as opposed to, sitting and watching a sunrise, or, going for a walk in a park, or, just being quiet in the company of somebody that you love, or with an animal. There's something that happens to us in those moments when we are not striving or clutching or needing to have an answer or something fill in. Yeah. Here's one from Ron, who asks, what exactly is an awakening experience? Now, we covered that a little bit, but maybe you can go into a little bit more detail about that. And if you have an example of that, I mean, there's a couple in the book, one by with Donna, who attempted suicide at some point. And I know that's a big one in terms of this letting go state. And I found your section on that to be quite interesting. Are you able to recall that, or do you want me to read a little bit?
No, I do remember that one. Yeah, Donna's she's a very inspiring example of transformation through turmoil. Well, to return to Ron's question, an awakening experience it's an expansion of awareness. It's an expansion and intensification of awareness. And so in awakening experiences, our perceptions become more intense. So the world around us looks more real and beautiful. We feel a sense of connection to nature, to other human beings. It's as if our identity expands and connects with other beings and other phenomena, so that we're no longer separate. We often feel a strong sense of compassion and love. And sometimes in very intense awakening experiences, there's a sense of going beyond time, even a sense that we're completely one with the world. We've lost our individuality entirely. And as you say, Donna had that experience when she was just about to attempt suicide. And it was almost as if, normal identity collapsed. And suddenly there was this new awareness. Everything around her looked more real and beautiful. And she realized all of her problems, which had overwhelmed her, were surmountable. And there was a sense of liberation, a sense of new meaning and harmony. And although awakening experiences are often temporary, in cases like Donna, in examples like Donna, it becomes an ongoing stable state, maybe at a slightly lower level of intensity, but it becomes an ongoing state of wakefulness, as I call it.
Wow. It just really is incredible, because as I listen to you describe this, and you've described this a few times to me, but every time I hear you describe it, I think about so many people who struggle with a state of kind of wanting things to be a certain way, and the pain that goes along with disappointments and frustrations, because inevitably life doesn't go a certain way. You end up encountering something that's strange or interferes with your plans, or things don't go quite the way you want, or you have an idea and it's like you can't get it, or somebody hits you with their car, or just things happen, and we find ourselves in these really frustrating life events that we're not in control. And just this ability to say, I don't need to be so in control. And, the freedom of not being in control, and, what that really means, and that actually this idea that holding on is not as useful as we might think it to be, and I think that can be frightening for a lot of people. But here's another one. This is a really interesting one. This is
I agree.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. This one is from Donna. She says, hello, Dr. Taylor. What do you mean by freedom in prison? How is someone free?
Oh, hi, Donna. That's a good question. But yeah, I think I used this quote in my book from a prisoner who said, I never realized how free I was until I went to prison. And I never realized how imprisoned I was outside prison until I came to prison. And what he meant by that was that he let go of his normal attachments. He let go of his attachment to his status or to his role, to his possessions, and he went inside himself and experienced a kind of inner contentment which he'd never had before. In my book, I found so many examples of transformation amongst prisoners that I had to devote 2 chapters to it because it was such a kind of rich subject. And I thought to myself, why is prison such a can be powerfully transformative experience for some people? Obviously not everybody, but for a minority of prisoners. I think part of it is because when you're in prison, there's a lot of inactivity, a lot of solitude. So people are forced to go into themselves, to explore themselves, and to reflect on themselves in a way that they never did before. Because when we live in normal society, we're so busy, we're so active, and there's so many ways to distract ourselves. So just the act of going inside themselves and exploring themselves can be revelatory for some people. It can make them aware that there is this whole inner dimension that they've never explored before. And also that there is this kind of inner well-being which they'd never explored before. So some prisoners, they just tap into this, this feeling of inner well-being and authenticity, which they've never had before. And also when you're in prison, you have to let go. Everything which defines your identity is outside the prison, on the other side of the prison wall. All your attachments, all of your possessions, all relationships, all of your ambitions is out there, and you have to let go. And that's why prison is a painful experience for some people, because your identity dissolves away. But for some people, letting go of their attachments and allowing their identity to dissolve can be a transformative experience, because when your normal identity dissolves, a new, more authentic, even a spiritual identity can emerge in its place. So that's why people do experience freedom in prison.
It's almost like you could write a whole book on that experience alone, the experience of self-reflection, whether it is because somebody has been in prison or because they have been limited in their contact and communication or ability to activate in their world. Because, some people feel like, oh my gosh, I can't do anything. I'm isolated, and I'm getting more and more depressed, more anxious. But there's this other piece that can occur as well that I think most people don't consider, don't think about. I mean, some people seek it out. Like you can decide to become a monk or, somehow isolate yourself as a intention. But in the case that, somebody is incarcerated, you're not choosing that directly, and yet you still are creating this isolated state. I mean, some people experienced this during COVID, actually.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, there are some parallels between the monastic life and the life of prisoners. I mean, to the extent that they both, we talk about cells, prison cells and a monk cell, because it involves that kind of detachment and that kind of withdrawal from everyday life, and it can lead to self-exploration and self-development.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Here's another one from Mike. We have a lot of really great questions. I'm sure this is because of you, Steve, because really this is such a great topic. It's so frothy with possibility, I think. This is from Mike, and he says, Steve has talked about encounters at the time of death. Does he mean religious things, meeting people that have already passed? What exactly is he referring to?
Well, it can involve those things, but basically, I talk about 2 types of encounters with death. One is simply when we have an encounter with death through serious illness or through an accident or an injury. So that could be a diagnosis of cancer, a heart attack, a car accident, and so forth. So those experiences can be transformational, as we've heard already. The second type is what are normally called near-death experiences. So that's when people may be clinically dead for a short time, but they report the experience of leaving their bodies and journeying through space. Sometimes they report meeting deceased relatives and have other strange experiences. So those experiences, near-death experiences, are incredibly transformational. In fact, I think I say in the book that near-death experiences are possibly the single most powerfully transformative experience that human beings can have. A near-death experience like that can last for a few seconds, but it can radically transform a person for the rest of their life. So yeah, and those are basically the two experiences. Occasionally, people do report having communications with a deceased person, so that can be a part of it as well. That's part of the bereavement process. I found that bereavement was a very significant process of transformation for many people, and that sometimes did involve the experience of communicating with a deceased person.
Wow. And then there's just this idea that we really can connect with something that is more than what we understand today. So we have a limited view of what we can achieve or what life really means or who we really are. We have a limited, I think, a very narrow and rigid view of that in our functional and transactional world. And even within the field of psychology, a lot of times, people can be taught to do things that are functional and transactional and limited. So if you're working with a therapist or you're getting this idea that in fact you just have to keep on bolstering up the same things you're already doing and do more of that, like see if you can allow yourself to just soften around what you think you have to have or what you think your life must be, and allow yourself to notice that it's okay to be soft around those things and less functional around it. You can be a little softer. You can allow yourself to not rigidly keep yourself in check around all these ideas of what you think life should be or how you should function in it, because there's so much more. This one is from Craig. Thanks, Craig, for writing in. Hi, Dr. Baranowski. Love the show today. Interesting topic. Yes, it is. Thank you so much, Steve, for being on today. I knew that we had to do this live, so I'm so glad that you're here. Does Steve believe in communicating with people after death? I know he has touched on this subject before. Is it true? Is it like a seance? Should I pull out my Ouija board? Oh my goodness. You're funny,
Wow.
Craig.
Yeah, get your Ouija board ready now.
Yeah.
No,
I'm pulling out my Ouija board from when I was like, I don't know, 12 years old or something, or 10.
Yeah, well, there is a lot of interesting research on this topic. I'm kind of open-minded. I used to be quite closed-minded about the topic of after-death communications, but I've seen so much interesting research in very tightly controlled scientific conditions that that it may be possible for. It seems impossible, but it may be possible for, in some sense, deceased people to communicate with us. I mean, I'm open-minded. I agree with you. I think so many people believe that human beings have an absolute objective view of reality and that we understand the universe pretty much. A lot of scientists think like this, but I don't think that's the case at all. I think there's so much more beyond what we are aware of and what we believe is possible. We're just animals with a certain degree of awareness, a certain degree of intelligence. We're just like sheep on a field, unaware of so many things around us. So I think, I'm open-minded.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the thing. It's like we don't have these answers, and we will limit ourselves if we try to just nail things down. And I imagine, Steve, that given the number of interviews you have done, and you've done hundreds of them, haven't you?
Yeah,
that you would hear things that would maybe be surprising if you didn't have so many examples of it. But the thing I'm really curious about, and it's probably a good place for us to wrap up, because we're just about at the end of our hour, believe it or not. By the way, you just got another email from Roy, who said, I love Steve on BBC's Breakfast, always a great guest. So I'm telling you that you're getting a lot of good
right,
feedback.
Great.
Two things. One, I'm really interested in what it's been like for you to do all these interviews, and was it expansive and uplifting for you as well, Steve?
It was, yeah, it was incredibly inspiring because I spoke to people who've been through probably some of the most extreme circumstances that human beings can experience, but they've transcended the difficulties and they've emerged from them in a heightened, awakened state. So yeah, there were many times when I had shivers going up my spine. I was in tears interviewing people, speaking to people. I was kind of losing my, my researcher's objectivity, but it was wonderful. I felt so inspired by speaking to these people. It really gave me a sense that human beings are, we're much more resilient, we're much stronger than we ever believe, because you only really find out how strong you are when you go through the most difficult circumstances. So I was meeting people who've gone through, really extreme circumstances, but they'd emerged in this amazing awakened state.
How do you think this has kind of changed you, or how do you feel like you have evolved as a result of doing these interviews and being open to the fact that, we can go through difficult things, which is really, in terms of what I've seen in the world, I mean, nobody gets to bypass this. We all go through difficult things together. How has this how have you evolved as a result of this?
It's certainly made me trust myself more. I have this feeling now that no matter what happens in my life, even when I do face crises again, when I go through trauma again, which we all will at some point, I have this faith that, there will be the resilience inside me to cope with any situation, because I've found that so many people. And it's also made me realize that, if you remember, I have a chapter on addiction, how people have recovered from addiction through transformation, through turmoil. And it's be aware that, you see people on the streets. I see a lot of people on the streets in Manchester who are addicts, homeless people. You see people in desperate situations. And, sometimes you may have a negative feeling towards these people. Sometimes people may become involved in criminal activity in these situations. But it's made aware that, there's always this potential for transformation in everybody, and that some of these people will undergo transformation. And there is all this this core of spirituality and this core of transformational potential inside everybody. So it's made me feel more compassionate to people who go through any kinds of difficulty as well.
Wow, that's really, really quite beautiful. So it almost sounds like there's something that has become permanent inside of you as a result of doing this work and recognizing spirit inside of other people.
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think I was always aware of that in the past, but I see it everywhere around me now, even in people, like, as I say, people who are involved in criminal activity, people who are in prison. I think everyone's undergoing a path of transformation. Some people maybe won't undergo transformation, but, everyone has got that potential. And sometimes it is really difficult circumstances which will harness that potential in us.
We're going to finish in just a couple of minutes. Do you have any kind of final thoughts or a story that you wanted to share with people before we end today?
Yeah, maybe I'd just like to remind people that, life, like the Buddha said, life involves suffering. We're always going to face challenges and crises regularly. And, we normally, when any kind of crisis is approaching us, we view it with fear and anxiety, which is entirely natural. We want to avoid it. But I think it's helpful to remember that crises and challenges always contain a core of spiritual transformative potential. It's like a golden core wrapped up inside them, deeply hidden inside them. So I think if we are aware of the transformational which is there, then it helps us to be less fearful and anxious of these situations. We can view them as opportunities as well as crises. And as long as we're prepared to acknowledge and accept the reality of these situations, then I think it's almost inevitable that we will undergo some kind of growth.
So this idea of suffering and the universality of it, I mean, and this is really something that I deal with every day in my clinic and with the with the work that I do in training and this radio show. I mean, most of it is, conversations like this, and it really brings a hopefulness, a realization that maybe there's something more going on that we can tap into, even in our scariest moments in life. I'm very appreciative of the research that you're doing on this awakening work, and that the worst moments in life can actually trigger an incredible evolution of ourselves as human beings. And I want to encourage everybody to really think about what might happen if you allow yourself to do exactly what Steve has suggested, which is really lean in, acknowledge and accept, explore that deeper stuff that's inside of you, embrace what is really happening, and kind of practice this surrender, this letting go. I want to thank you so much, Steve, for joining us today, all our listeners. And remember, you can listen and enjoy Steve's work at his website at stephenmtaylor.com. Pick up a copy of his book, Extraordinary Awakenings, When Trauma Leads to Transformation by Steve Taylor. Steve, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to you.
I'll look forward to another call again in the future. And again, bye to everybody, and be well.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.